Settle into your comfortable space, dear listener, and let your breathing slow as we journey back through the mists of time, over 1,000 years ago, to the autumn of 1016 in Anglo-Saxon England. The leaves have turned to gold and copper, and the air carries the crisp promise of coming winter. Our tale unfolds during one of history's pivotal moments, the Battle of Ashingdon, but we shall experience it through gentler eyes, following the measured steps of Bjorn Lawspeaker, a respected member of the Thing, the ancient Norse assembly of governance. Close your eyes if you wish, and imagine the soft glow of oil lamps in a great Viking hall, the distant murmur of voices discussing matters of great import, and the comforting crackle of hearth fires keeping the October chill at bay. This is not a tale of battle and bloodshed, but rather of wisdom, patience, and the quiet dignity of those who serve their people through counsel rather than sword. The world was still wrapped in darkness when Bjorn Lawspeaker stirred in his sleeping quarters within the great hall at Ashingdon. The thick woolen blankets, woven with the careful hands of Danish craftswomen, held the warmth of his body against the pre-dawn chill. Outside, he could hear the gentle patter of autumn rain against the wooden roof shingles, a sound as old as time itself. Bjorn had been a member of the Thing for 15 winters now, chosen for his ability to remember the old laws word for word, and for his gift of finding peaceful solutions where others saw only conflict. At 43 summers, his beard had begun to show threads of silver among the brown, and his eyes carried the wisdom of countless assemblies, negotiations, and judgments. The hall where he rested was not the grand structure one might imagine from the sagas, but rather a practical building of oak timber and thatch, built to house the administrative needs of the Danish forces under Knut's command. The Battle of Ashingdon loomed on the horizon, but for Bjorn and his fellow Thing members, their battlefield was one of words, laws, and careful diplomacy. He rose slowly, his joints protesting slightly in the cool air. The packed earth floor was cold beneath his feet as he reached for his leather shoes, soft and worn from years of use. The leather had been treated with fish oil to keep it supple and water-resistant, and it gave off a faint, not unpleasant scent that mingled with the smoky aroma that perpetually hung in the rafters. Around him, other members of the Thing still slept. There was Gunnar the Wise, whose snoring rumbled like distant thunder, and young Eric Scrollkeeper, who even in sleep clutched a leather satchel containing precious written records. The Thing had evolved much since the old days in the homeland. Here in England, they had learned to blend their oral traditions with the Saxon love of written documentation. Bjorn wrapped his woolen cloak around his shoulders, a fine piece dyed deep blue with woad, fastened with a bronze brooch that had belonged to his father. The metal was worn smooth from decades of daily use, and his fingers found comfort in its familiar curves. He made his way carefully through the sleeping hall, his footsteps muffled by the fresh rushes strewn across the floor. The rushes had been mixed with meadowsweet and lavender, releasing a gentle fragrance when crushed underfoot. Outside, the world was painted in shades of gray and silver. The rain had stopped, leaving everything glistening with moisture. Bjorn made his way to the well, where he drew up the leather bucket with practiced ease. The water was cold and clear, tasting of iron and earth. He splashed it on his face, the shock of it driving away the last vestiges of sleep. This had been his morning ritual for as long as he could remember, a moment of solitude before the day's responsibilities began. His father had taught him that a man should greet each dawn with clear eyes and a clear mind, especially a man whose words could shape the fate of hundreds. The camp was beginning to stir around him. Smoke rose from cooking fires as the morning meal was prepared. He could smell porridge beginning to bubble, a mixture of barley and oats that would be sweetened with honey for those who could afford it, or seasoned with salt for the common warriors. The aroma of baking bread drifted from the clay ovens, where the bakers had been working since the middle of the night. Bjorn walked slowly toward the eastern edge of the camp, where a small grove of oak trees stood. This was where the Thing members often gathered for their morning discussions, away from the bustle of the main camp. The oaks were ancient, their gnarled trunks bearing witness to centuries of human drama. Some said these very trees had sheltered Roman legionnaires, and before them, the ancient Britons with their mysterious stone circles. As he walked, he observed the camp coming to life. Young boys ran between the tents carrying messages and supplies. Warriors checked their equipment with methodical care, not in preparation for immediate battle, but as part of their daily routine. The actual fighting was still days away, and these quiet moments of preparation were as much a part of warfare as the clash of shields. A group of women passed him, carrying baskets of wool for spinning. They nodded respectfully, recognizing the silver Thor's hammer that hung around his neck, a symbol not just of his faith, but of his position as a lawspeaker. One of them, a widow named Astrid whose husband had fallen in an earlier skirmish, paused to speak. "Lawspeaker Bjorn," she said softly, "my son wishes to join the shield wall when the battle comes. He has seen only 14 summers." Bjorn's expression softened. This was the kind of matter that often came before the Thing, not the grand strategies of war, but the small, human concerns that made up the fabric of their society. "Bring him to the Thing gathering at midday," he said gently. "We will hear his case, and yours. The law has wisdom in these matters, but so does a mother's heart." She smiled gratefully and hurried after her companions. Bjorn continued his walk, his mind already turning over the precedents and laws that might apply to the boy's situation. By the time the sun had fully risen, painting the autumn landscape in soft golds and browns, Bjorn had made his way to the Thing's meeting place. It was not a grand hall but rather a large tent of waxed wool, proof against the unpredictable English weather. Inside, wooden benches were arranged in a rough circle, with a raised platform at one end where the senior Thing members would sit. Already, several of his colleagues had gathered. There was Thorstein Silvertongue, whose gift for rhetoric could make even the most mundane legal matters sound like poetry. Beside him sat Magnus the Memory Keeper, an elderly man whose mind contained decades of legal precedents and ancestral wisdom. Young Eric had arrived too, his writing materials already spread before him on a small wooden table. "Good morning, brothers," Bjorn greeted them, taking his customary seat on the bench reserved for lawspeakers. The wood was smooth and worn, shaped by years of use. "A good morning to you, Bjorn," replied Thorstein. "Though I wonder how many more peaceful mornings we shall see. The scouts report that Edmund Ironside's forces are massing. The battle cannot be more than 2 days hence." "All the more reason," said Magnus in his reedy voice, "to ensure our work is completed. There are inheritance matters to settle, oaths to witness, and disputes to resolve. War does not pause the need for law." This was the heart of their purpose. While the warriors prepared for battle, the Thing members worked to maintain the social fabric that held their people together. They were the keepers of civilization, ensuring that regardless of the outcome of the coming battle, there would be order and justice for those who survived. The morning's agenda was lengthy but not unusual. First, there was a dispute between two merchants over the ownership of a shipment of wool that had arrived from Denmark. Then, a case of theft, a warrior accused of taking another man's sword. After that, 3 marriages to be witnessed and recorded, and finally, the matter of young Astrid's son. As the tent filled with petitioners and witnesses, Bjorn felt the familiar settling of his mind into the rhythms of legal procedure. This was his battlefield, where words were weapons and wisdom was armor. The oil lamps were lit despite the daylight, casting a warm glow that made the tent feel almost cozy despite the serious matters at hand. The sun had reached its zenith by the time they addressed the matter of the merchant's wool. The tent had grown warm with the press of bodies, and the air was thick with the scent of damp wool, leather, and the earthy smell of many people gathered in close quarters. Yet there was something comforting about it, the smell of community, of civilization continuing despite the chaos of war. Bjorn listened carefully as each merchant presented his case. Rolf claimed he had purchased the wool in Denmark before the journey, while Sigurd insisted he had been commissioned to transport it for a fee, making him the rightful owner upon delivery. Both men had witnesses, though their testimonies conflicted. "Let us consider the precedents," Bjorn said, his voice calm and measured. He had learned long ago that a lawspeaker's greatest tool was not volume but clarity. In the time of King Harald Fairhair, a similar case arose concerning a shipment of timber from Norway. He recounted the case from memory, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of oral tradition. The tent grew quiet as he spoke, everyone leaning in to hear the ancient wisdom. This was the power of the thing, it connected them to their ancestors, to the long chain of justice that stretched back to the beginning of their people. After much deliberation, the thing ruled that the wool should be divided equally between the 2 merchants, with each paying compensation to the other for the inconvenience. It was a compromise that left neither fully satisfied but both able to continue their business. This was often the way of the thing, finding the path that preserved peace and allowed life to continue. The theft case was simpler. The accused warrior, a young man named Olaf, admitted his guilt when confronted with the evidence. The stolen sword was returned, and Olaf was sentenced to pay compensation and to serve the wronged party for 1 month. It was a lenient sentence, considering the times, but the thing recognized that with battle approaching, every warrior would be needed. The marriages were a welcome respite from conflict. 3 couples stood before the thing to have their unions witnessed and blessed. Bjorn spoke the ancient words that bound them together, his voice warm with genuine happiness for the young people starting their lives together, even in such uncertain times. There was something deeply moving about witnessing these unions on the eve of battle. It spoke to the stubborn optimism of humanity, the insistence on building and creating even when destruction loomed. Each couple exchanged arm rings, the metal bright in the lamplight, and the gathered crowd cheered softly, mindful of maintaining the dignity of the proceedings. After the midday meal, a simple affair of bread, cheese, and preserved fish, washed down with weak ale, Bjorn found himself with a rare moment of leisure. The thing would not reconvene until late afternoon, when they would hear the case of Astrid's son. He walked through the camp, observing the life that continued despite the approaching storm of battle. Near the smith's forge, he paused to watch the craftsmen at work. The rhythmic ringing of hammer on anvil was almost musical, a steady heartbeat of creation. The smith was making arrowheads, but the care he took with each one elevated the work beyond mere warfare. Each piece was perfectly balanced, a tiny work of functional art. The smell of hot metal and coal smoke was sharp but not unpleasant. It reminded Bjorn of his youth, when he had spent a summer learning the smith's craft. His hands had proven too clumsy for fine work, but he had gained an appreciation for the patience and skill required. Further on, he came upon a group of women working at their looms. The click-clack of the heddles and the soft whisper of thread through thread created a peaceful symphony. They were weaving cloaks for the warriors, thick, warm garments that would protect against the coming winter, whether their owners survived the battle or not. One of the women, seeing his interest, showed him the pattern she was working into the cloth, a complex interlace of lines that seemed to have no beginning or end. "It represents the web of fate," she explained, her fingers never stopping their work. "We are all connected, all part of the same great weaving. Your work in the thing, our work here, the warriors preparing for battle, all threads in the same cloth." Bjorn nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words. He had often thought of law in similar terms. Each decision, each precedent, was a thread that helped bind society together. He continued his walk to the area where the livestock were kept. The cattle lowed softly, their breath forming small clouds in the cooling afternoon air. The familiar sounds and smells of the animals, the sweet scent of hay, the earthier smell of manure, the warm animal musk, were deeply comforting. These creatures represented life continuing, the promise that regardless of what happened in battle, there would be milk to drink, cheese to make, leather to tan. A young boy was tending the animals, carefully checking each cow's hooves for stones or injuries. He worked with quiet competence, speaking softly to each animal as he worked. This too was a form of service, no less important than the warriors or the lawspeakers. As the afternoon shadows grew long, Bjorn returned to the Thing tent. Astrid and her son were already waiting, along with several other Thing members who had assembled to hear the case. The boy, whose name was Leif, stood straight and tall despite his youth, trying to project the image of a warrior. Bjorn studied him carefully. The boy had his mother's eyes, intelligent and determined, but his frame was still that of a child, all knobby joints and uncertain proportions. His hands, Bjorn noticed, were smooth and unmarked by the calluses that came from years of weapon practice. "State your case, young Leif," Magnus said, his ancient voice kind but formal. The boy stepped forward, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. "Honored members of the Thing, I seek permission to join the shield wall in the coming battle. I have practiced with sword and spear. I am not afraid. My father died with honor, and I wish to follow his example." There was a murmur of sympathy from the gathered observers. Many had lost fathers, sons, brothers in the endless conflicts that had marked these years. Thorstein Silvertongue leaned forward. "And what says your mother to this request?" Astrid stepped forward, her face composed but her hands twisted in the fabric of her dress. "Honored Thing, I understand my son's desire to serve. His father would be proud of his courage. But he is my only child, all I have left of my husband. I ask the Thing to consider not just the law, but mercy." Bjorn exchanged glances with his fellow Thing members. This was not simply a legal matter but a deeply human one. The law allowed boys of 14 to join the battle if they could lift a shield and spear, but it did not require it. "Young Leif," Bjorn said, his voice gentle, "tell us, can you read?" The boy looked confused. "Some, Lawspeaker. My mother has taught me." "And can you count?" Keep records? Yes, Lawspeaker. Bjorn nodded thoughtfully. The thing has need of young men with such skills. Eric's Scrollkeeper requires an assistant to help maintain the records of our proceedings. It is not the glory of the shield wall, but it is service nonetheless. The laws we preserve, the records we keep, these will outlast any single battle. Would you consider this alternative? The boy's face showed his internal struggle. The glory of battle called to him, but there was also relief there, relief he tried to hide. Furthermore, added Thorstein, understanding Bjorn's approach, such service would prepare you for future membership in the thing itself. A Lawspeaker or Scrollkeeper serves his people for decades, not just in a single day of battle. Astrid's eyes shone with tears of gratitude. The boy looked at his mother, then back at the thing members. I would be honored to serve the thing, he said finally, his voice stronger now. Then it is decided, Magnus pronounced. Leif, son of Astrid, shall serve as assistant to Eric Scrollkeeper, beginning immediately. This is the judgment of the thing. As mother and son left the tent, Astrid caught Bjorn's eye and mouthed a silent thank you. He nodded slightly, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came from finding a solution that preserved both honor and life. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, the camp gathered for the evening meal. This was a more elaborate affair than the morning's simple porridge. Great cauldrons of stew had been simmering all day, a rich mixture of beef, root vegetables, and barley, seasoned with wild herbs gathered from the surrounding countryside. Bjorn sat with his fellow thing members at one of the long tables set up in the main hall. The building was warm with the heat of many bodies and the great central fire pit. Smoke rose to the rafters, where it escaped through carefully placed gaps in the roof. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the carved dragon heads on the support pillars seem to move with life of their own. The hall was filled with the comfortable chaos of communal dining. Warriors discussed tactics and boasted of past victories. Women shared gossip and practical advice. Children, those few who were in the camp, played between the tables, their laughter a bright note in the evening symphony. Bjorn's wooden bowl was filled with the steaming stew, and he ate slowly, savoring each bite. The meat was tender, falling apart at the touch of his spoon. The vegetables had absorbed the rich flavors of the broth, and the barley provided a satisfying, filling substance. Fresh bread, still warm from the ovens, was passed around, perfect for soaking up the last drops of broth. To drink, there was ale, not the finest, but good enough, with a nutty flavor and just enough strength to warm the belly without clouding the mind. The thing members needed their wits about them always, even in relaxation. As they ate, they discussed the matters of the day, but also shared stories and memories. Magnus told a tale from his youth, about a thing assembly that had lasted 3 days because no one could agree on the proper compensation for a stolen pig that had subsequently given birth to a litter of piglets. The question had been, who owned the piglets, the original owner of the pig, or the thief who had fed and cared for it during her pregnancy? The story drew laughter, but also thoughtful nods. These were the kinds of complex questions that the thing existed to answer, the small matters that, taken together, formed the foundation of their society. Young Eric, emboldened by ale and company, shared a riddle he had heard from a traveling skald. I am the black child of a white father. A wingless bird flying through heaven. I give tears to those who meet me. though I cause no sorrow. And at once I am gone, though I was never there. The Thing members pondered this as they ate, proposing various answers. Finally, Bjorn smiled and said, "Smoke. Like that which rises from our fire even now." Eric grinned and nodded, pleased that his riddle had provided entertainment. As the meal concluded and the tables were cleared, a smaller group gathered for what was known as the night session. This was not an official meeting of the Thing, but rather an informal gathering where the most complex and sensitive matters were discussed without the pressure of public scrutiny. They met in a smaller chamber off the main hall, where thick tapestries on the walls muffled sound and provided privacy. The tapestries depicted scenes from the old stories: Odin sacrificing himself on the world tree to gain wisdom, Thor fishing for the world serpent, Tyr placing his hand in Fenrir's mouth. These images reminded them that sacrifice and courage took many forms, not all of them violent. The room was lit by oil lamps placed in wall brackets, their steady glow more reliable than the flickering fire. The air was scented with imported frankincense, a luxury that none had provided for the Thing's use. It was said to clarify thought and promote wisdom. Tonight's discussion centered on what would happen after the battle, regardless of its outcome. If not prevailed, how would they integrate Saxon law with Danish custom? If Edmund Ironside won, what provisions could be made for the Danish settlers who had made England their home? "We must think like the roots of a tree," Magnus said, his aged hands gesturing expressively. "We must grow deep and spread wide, adapting to the soil we find ourselves in. The Saxons have good laws, especially regarding property and inheritance. We would be foolish to discard them entirely." Thorstein nodded. "And they have learned from us as well. The concept of wergild, paying compensation for crimes rather than seeking blood vengeance, has found fertile ground here." Bjorn contributed his own thoughts. "Perhaps what we need is not to choose between Saxon and Danish law, but to create something new in English law that draws from both traditions." This was radical thinking, but the others considered it seriously. They spent hours discussing the practical details. How would courts be structured? Who would have jurisdiction over different types of cases? How would they train a new generation of law speakers who understood both traditions? Young Leif, Astrid's son, sat in the corner, carefully recording the discussion. Eric had already begun his training, teaching him the shorthand symbols that allowed for faster writing. The boy's presence was a reminder that their discussions were not merely theoretical, they were planning for a future that young people like Leif would inherit. As midnight approached, Bjorn excused himself for his nightly ritual. This was a private time, a moment of connection with the divine that he had observed since taking his oath as a law speaker. He made his way to a small shrine that had been erected at the edge of the camp. It was a simple structure, 4 posts supporting a small roof, sheltering a carved wooden figure of Tyr, the god of justice and righteous war. Tyr was the patron of the Thing, the god who had sacrificed his hand to bind the wolf Fenrir, showing that sometimes justice required personal sacrifice. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant in the black sky. Bjorn could identify the constellations his father had taught him. There was Thor's wagon, what the Saxons called the plough, and there the bright star that never moved, around which all the heavens turned. He lit a small fire before the shrine using flint and steel, the sparks bright in the darkness. Into the flames, he placed an offering, a small portion of bread and a few drops of ale, simple gifts but given with sincere heart. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying his prayers to the gods. He did not pray for victory in the coming battle, that was for warriors to ask. Instead, he prayed for wisdom, for the ability to see clearly through the fog of human passion and find the path of justice. He prayed for the strength to make difficult decisions, and for the compassion to temper justice with mercy. As he stood there, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Astrid approaching, a thick cloak wrapped around her against the cold. "Forgive me, Lawspeaker," she said softly. "I did not mean to intrude on your prayers." "There is no intrusion," Bjorn replied. "The gods hear all prayers, whether spoken in solitude or company." She moved to stand beside him, looking into the small fire. "I wanted to thank you again. For my son. You found a way to preserve his honor while keeping him safe." "The thing seeks always to preserve life when possible," Bjorn said. "Your son will serve our people well. In time, he may become a Lawspeaker himself. Such minds are rarer and more valuable than sword arms." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the fire consume the offerings. Finally, Astrid spoke again. "My husband used to say that the thing was the true strength of our people. Not our warriors or our ships, but our laws. He said that other peoples might conquer with swords, but we conquered with justice." Bjorn nodded slowly. "Your husband was a wise man. Laws outlive kings and kingdoms. The Roman Empire fell, but Roman law still influences the world. Perhaps, in centuries to come, people will still reference the decisions we make here, in this camp, on the eve of battle." After Astrid departed, Bjorn remained at the shrine a while longer, but eventually, the cold drove him back to the hall. The main room was quiet now, with only a few sentries maintaining watch. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting a ruddy light that made everything seem wrapped in warm bronze. He made his way to the thing's chamber, where he found Eric still awake, working by lamplight to complete the day's records. The young man was dedicated to his craft, understanding that the written word was a form of immortality. "You should rest," Bjorn advised. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges." Eric looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from strain. "I wanted to finish recording the discussion about legal integration. I fear that if the battle goes badly, these ideas might be lost." Bjorn sat beside him, looking at the neat rows of runic script mixed with Latin letters, another example of the cultural blending that was occurring. "Tell me," Bjorn said, "what do you think of our discussion tonight?" Eric set down his stylus, considering. I think we stand at a crossroads. Not just because of the battle, but because of what we represent. We are not purely Danish anymore, nor are we Saxon. We are becoming something new. And does that trouble you?" "No," Eric said after a pause. "Change is the nature of life. Even the gods themselves are subject to fate. Our laws must grow and change too, or they become dead things, mere words without meaning." Bjorn was impressed by the young man's wisdom. "You will make a fine Lawspeaker one day." Eric flushed at the praise. "I still have much to learn." "Today, when you recalled that case from King Harold's time, how do you remember such things so clearly?" Bjorn smiled. "My father taught me the art of memory. Each case, each law, is like a room in a great hall. You furnish each room with the details of the case, and then you can walk through the hall in your mind, visiting each room as needed. But more than that, you must understand the spirit behind the law, not just the letter. Laws are born from human need, from the desire for fairness and order. When you understand why a law was made, remembering it becomes easier. They talked for another hour, Bjorn sharing the techniques and wisdom passed down through generations of law speakers. Outside, they could hear the changing of the guard, the soft challenges and responses as fresh sentries took their posts. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both. Bjorn made his way to his sleeping space, but rest eluded him. His mind was too full of the day's events and tomorrow's possibilities. He lay on his straw-filled mattress, listening to the sounds of the sleeping hall. Gunnar's snoring had settled into a steady rhythm. Someone muttered in their sleep, perhaps reliving past glories or fears. The building itself seemed to breathe, the wooden beams creaking softly as they cooled in the night air. Unable to sleep, Bjorn rose again and wrapped himself in his cloak. He stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. This was the quietest time in the camp, when even the sentries fought against drowsiness. A mist had risen from the nearby river, wrapping everything in a soft, gray blanket that muffled sound and made the world seem dreamlike. He walked slowly through the camp, his footsteps silent on the dew-wet grass. Here and there, he could see the glow of watchfires, their light diffused by the mist into gentle orbs of gold. The sight was almost magical, as if he walked through the realm of the elves rather than a military camp. Near the horse lines, he found a sentry standing watch, a young warrior named Hakon whom he recognized from a previous legal matter. The boy had been accused of falling asleep on watch but had been acquitted when witnesses confirmed he had been ill with fever. "A quiet night, Hakon?" Bjorn asked softly. The young man started slightly, then relaxed when he recognized the Lawspeaker. "Yes, Lord. The horses are restless, though. They sense the coming battle, perhaps." Indeed, Bjorn could hear the horses shifting and nickering softly. These were not the great destriers of later centuries, but sturdy, practical animals bred for endurance rather than size. Their breath formed clouds in the cold air, and their eyes gleamed in the darkness. "Animals often know things we do not," Bjorn observed. "They live more closely with the natural world, while we wrap ourselves in civilization and sometimes forget we are part of nature too." Hakon nodded, though Bjorn wasn't sure the young man fully understood. That was all right, wisdom often planted seeds that only bloomed years later. As Bjorn made his way back to the hall, the eastern sky was just beginning to show the faintest suggestion of light, not yet dawn, but the promise of it. He realized he had come full circle, through a complete day and night in the life of the camp. Tomorrow, or rather, later today, for the hour was now very late, the routine would begin again. There would be new cases to hear, new disputes to settle, new marriages to witness. And eventually, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after, there would be the battle. Men would die, kingdoms would rise or fall, and historians would mark it as a significant date. But for the Thing, the work would continue. If not won, they would help establish Danish law more firmly in England. If Edmund prevailed, they would work to protect the rights of Danish settlers under Saxon rule. Either way, they would continue to be the weavers of civilization, binding society together with threads of justice and precedent. Back in the hall, Bjorn finally felt sleep calling to him. He lay down once more, pulling the woolen blankets up to his chin. Around him, his fellow Thing members slept peacefully, their breathing a gentle chorus in the darkness. As he drifted toward sleep, Bjorn thought about the young boy Leif, beginning his journey toward becoming a keeper of laws. He thought about the couples married today, starting new lives together despite the uncertainty of war. He thought about the merchants with their wool, the warriors preparing for battle, the women at their looms, all the countless threads that made up the great tapestry of their society. His last conscious thought was a prayer, not for victory or glory, but for wisdom. For the strength to continue their work of building and preserving, of finding justice in a world that often seemed to value only strength. For the patience to plant seeds of law and civilization that might not bloom for generations. And then, finally, blessed sleep claimed him, deep and dreamless, the rest of a man who had spent his day in service to others, maintaining the bonds that held his world together. Outside, the first birds began their tentative morning songs, heralding another day in the great cycle of history. In the deep peace before true dawn, when sleep had refreshed his mind but the day had not yet begun its demands, Bjorn found himself in that gentle state between waking and sleeping where thoughts flow like quiet streams. His mind wandered over the patterns of his life, the daily rhythms that gave structure to existence even in times of war. He thought of his childhood in Denmark, where his father had first taught him the laws. They would sit by the fire on winter nights, and his father would recite the ancient codes, his voice rising and falling in the traditional cadences that made memorization easier. The law is a living thing, his father had said. It must grow and change, but slowly, carefully, like a tree that bends with the wind but does not break. Those lessons had shaped him, made him who he was. Now, lying in this English hall, so far from his birthplace, he understood his father's wisdom more deeply. The thing here was different from the assemblies of his youth, influenced by Saxon customs, by the practical needs of governing a conquered territory, by the mixing of peoples that was creating something entirely new. The wool blanket against his skin was rough but warm, woven in the Danish style but from English sheep. Even in such simple things, the blending of cultures was evident. They were all becoming something new, something that was neither purely Danish nor Saxon but uniquely English. He could hear Eric stirring nearby, the young man always first to rise, eager to begin his work with the records. That enthusiasm reminded Bjorn of himself at that age, when every day had brought new knowledge to absorb, new precedents to memorize. The burden of years had not dimmed his passion for the law, but it had tempered it with the understanding of how much suffering could be prevented by wise judgment, and how much could be caused by foolish decisions. As true dawn approached, painting the inside of the hall with pale light through the smoke holes in the roof, Bjorn rose for the second time. This time, the hall was stirring with him. The morning routine began again, as it had for countless days before and would for countless days to come, regardless of battles won or lost. He performed his ablutions with care, washing his face and hands in the cold water, combing his beard with a bone comb that had belonged to his grandfather. These small rituals connected him to his ancestors, to the long line of Lawspeakers stretching back into the mists of time. The morning porridge was being prepared again, its nutty aroma filling the hall. Today it was flavored with a small amount of butter, a luxury that spoke to the relative prosperity of Nuts' forces. Bjorn ate slowly, appreciating each spoonful. He had learned long ago that rushing through meals disturbed the digestion and clouded the thinking. Around him, conversations were subdued. Word had come during the night that Edmund's forces were closer than expected. The battle might come tomorrow, or even this afternoon. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted subtly, still calm, but with an undercurrent of tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Yet the work of the Thing could not stop. There were still marriages to witness, still disputes to settle, still the daily maintenance of civil order that continued regardless of military matters. This was what separated them from mere raiders or conquerors. They brought law, structure, civilization. After breakfast, Bjorn met with Magnus and Thorstein to discuss the day's agenda. There was a complex inheritance case to consider. A wealthy merchant had died without sons, leaving 3 daughters and a brother, all claiming his estate. Saxon law and Danish custom differed significantly on such matters. "We must find a middle way," Magnus counseled, his ancient voice thoughtful. "If we favor Danish custom too heavily, we alienate the Saxon population. But if we abandon our own laws entirely, we lose ourselves." This was the constant balance they had to maintain, the careful dance between tradition and adaptation. They spent an hour discussing precedents, both Danish and Saxon, looking for common ground on which to build their decision. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the Thing convened for what might be their last full session before the battle. The tent was packed with petitioners, everyone aware that this might be their last chance to have their matters heard before the chaos of war descended. Bjorn presided with extra care, aware of the weight of the moment. Each decision might be the last he rendered, each word of law he spoke might be the final time he exercised his office. This knowledge did not make him hasty or careless. Instead, it sharpened his focus, made him more determined than ever to dispense justice fairly. The inheritance case was heard first. The 3 daughters stood together, united in their claim despite Saxon custom that would normally favor the uncle. The brother, a man named Ulf, argued for Danish tradition that favored male relatives. Bjorn listened to all sides, then consulted with his fellow Thing members. After much deliberation, they reached a decision that drew from both traditions. The estate would be divided, with the daughters receiving the merchant's business and dwelling, while the uncle received the landed property. It was a compromise that acknowledged both Saxon and Danish concepts of inheritance. "This decision stands as precedent," Bjorn announced formally. "Let it be recorded that in matters of inheritance where customs conflict, the Thing seeks balance and practical justice over rigid adherence to single tradition." Eric scratched away with his stylus, recording every word. These records would outlive them all, carrying their decisions forward into an uncertain future. The rest of the day was filled with smaller matters: a dispute over the ownership of a milk cow, the registration of a birth, the formal recognition of a young warrior's coming of age. Each matter was handled with the same careful attention, the same respect for law and custom. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, a messenger arrived. Edmund Ironside's army was in position. The battle would come with tomorrow's dawn. The Thing concluded its session with unusual formality. They all understood that some of them might not survive the coming day. Even Thing members might be called to defend the camp if the battle went badly. Bjorn spoke the closing words: "Let all who have heard these proceedings know that justice has been done according to law and custom. May the gods witness our judgments and find them worthy. May our decisions bring peace rather than strife, order rather than chaos. The Thing is concluded." As darkness fell on what might be their last night, the camp took on a different character. warriors sharpened weapons and checked armor. Final messages were written to distant families. The Christian priests among Edmund's forces could be heard singing their prayers across the field, while in Knut's camp, offerings were made to the old gods. But in the Thing's tent, one final duty remained. Young Leif, Astrid's son, was formally inducted as Eric's assistant. It was a simple ceremony. The boys swore an oath to preserve and protect the records, to learn the laws, and to serve justice above personal interest. Bjorn placed his hand on the boy's head in blessing. "You carry forward our traditions," he said solemnly. "Whatever comes tomorrow, the law continues. The Thing continues. Through you and others like you, justice outlives us all." The boy's eyes were bright with the solemnity of the moment. His mother watched from the back of the tent, tears on her cheeks, grateful that her son had found an honorable path that might spare him from tomorrow's slaughter. As the ceremony concluded and people dispersed to their final preparations or rest, Bjorn found himself alone with his thoughts. He walked once more to the shrine of Tyr, where he made his final offerings. The god of justice looked down with his carved wooden eyes, eternally wise, eternally sacrifice-marked. "Grant us wisdom," Bjorn prayed. "Not victory, for that is in the hands of fate, but wisdom to rebuild after the storm passes. Wisdom to blend our peoples into something stronger than either alone. Wisdom to preserve what is best in our laws while adapting to new realities." The stars wheeled overhead, eternal and uncaring about human conflicts. Yet in their unchanging patterns, Bjorn found comfort. The stars that looked down on this night had looked down on his ancestors and would look down on descendants he would never know. The work of the Thing, the preservation of law and justice, was part of that eternal cycle. He returned to the hall for the last time, where he found his fellow Thing members gathered around the central fire. They did not speak of tomorrow's battle, but instead shared stories of great legal decisions from the past, of clever judgments and wise compromises. They spoke of the future too, of the laws that might govern a unified England, of the possibilities that existed when different traditions met and merged. As the fire burned low and one by one they sought their beds, Bjorn remained awake a while longer. He thought of all the daily rhythms he had witnessed, the morning prayers, the afternoon judgments, the evening meals, the nighttime reflections. These patterns would continue, regardless of who claimed victory tomorrow. The sun would rise, people would dispute and marry and trade, children would be born, and someone would need to maintain the laws that held it all together. Finally, as the last coals settled into ash, Bjorn sought his own rest. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, in this moment, the law lived. Justice had been served. The work of civilization had continued for one more day. He pulled his woolen blanket up to his chin, feeling its familiar rough warmth. Around him, his brothers in the Thing slept peacefully. Somewhere in the camp, young Leif was probably too excited to sleep, clutching his new stylus and tablets, ready to begin his journey as a keeper of laws. And so Bjorn Lawspeaker closed his eyes, letting sleep claim him, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, the seeds they had planted of justice, of law, of peaceful resolution would continue to grow. The Thing would endure, adapting and evolving but never disappearing, because every society needed those who stood between chaos and order, between might and right, between the sword and the law. In his dreams, he saw a future England where Saxon and Dane had become one people, governed by laws that drew from both traditions. He saw young Leif as an old man, teaching new generations the importance of justice. He saw the records Eric kept being consulted centuries hence, their decisions still influencing the course of justice. And in that vision of continuity, of civilization persevering despite all trials, Bjorn found peace. The battle would come with dawn, but tonight, in this gentle hour, all was well. The law lived. Justice endured. And somewhere in the darkness, a young boy practiced his letters, preparing to carry forward the eternal work of the Thing. The night deepened, wrapping the camp in its peaceful embrace. Tomorrow would bring thunder and fury, blood and decision. But tonight, there was only the quiet breathing of sleeping men, the distant cry of a night bird, and the eternal stars watching over all. The patterns of daily life, the rhythms of civilization, continued their ancient dance, unchanging and unchangeable, the true victory of law over chaos, of order over destruction, of human wisdom over animal instinct. And in that triumph, small and quiet though it might be, lay the real story of the Battle of Ashingdon, not the clash of shields or the fall of kings, but the continuation of justice, the preservation of law, the endless, patient work of those who built rather than destroyed, who preserved rather than pillaged, who understood that true strength lay not in the sword but in the wisdom to know when not to use it. Thus ended another day in the life of the Thing, perhaps the last before great changes came. But it had been a good day, a day of justice served and mercy shown, of traditions honored and new precedents set. And in the annals of history, though the battle might be remembered more dramatically, it was days like this, quiet, thoughtful, dedicated to law and order, that truly shaped the world to come. Sleep now, gentle listener, as Bjorn sleeps, wrapped in wool and warmth, dreaming of justice and peace. Let the rhythms of that ancient time soothe you into your own rest, knowing that somewhere, in every age, there are those who stand guard over civilization, who preserve the laws that protect us all, who choose wisdom over violence and justice over vengeance. The night is deep, the stars are bright, and all is well in this moment before history turns its page. Rest now, and dream of justice, of law, of the patient work that builds worlds rather than destroying them. Tomorrow will come with its own challenges, but tonight, in this gentle hour, there is only peace.